The spring of 1958 came to Hardin County, Ohio, the way it always did. Slow at first, then all at once. The frost left the ground in late March, pulling back from the fields the way a tide pulls back from a shore, leaving the dark soil exposed and soft and smelling of everything that had been sleeping underneath it all winter. The red-winged blackbirds returned to the fence rows. The creek at the bottom of the Morse property ran high and fast with snowmelt cutting a brown line through the pale landscape. The redbud trees along the county road put out their small purple flowers before they even had leaves, the way they always did, rushing the season impatient after the cold. It was by every measure a normal spring in northwestern Ohio, except for the sound. It started in the second week of April, a low mechanical whine that carried across the flat fields when the wind was right. Calvin Morse heard it from his kitchen on a Tuesday morning, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the light come up over the north fields. He knew what it was immediately. He had been hearing it in other counties for 2 years. He had been reading about it in the farm papers all winter. He had been watching it come toward Hardin County, the way you watch a weather front moving in from the west, knowing it will arrive, not knowing exactly when, not knowing exactly how bad it will be when it gets here. The chainsaws had arrived. Calvin set his coffee cup on the windowsill and looked out at his north fields. The 30 acres of timber that ran along his northern boundary stood dark and still in the early morning light. Oak and hickory and a handful of black walnut, their bare branches just beginning to show the first swollen buds of spring. The woods had been there his entire life. They had been there his father's entire life. They had been there before anyone in his family was born in Ohio, standing on that limestone ridge, the way old things stand without explanation, without announcement, simply present. He watched the tree line for a long moment. Then he went out to start the day. Calvin Morse was 43 years old in the spring of 1958. He was not a tall man, but he was solid in the way that men who work outdoors in all weather become solid. His hands wide and calloused, his face weathered to a permanent reddish brown from decades of Ohio sun. He had taken over the farm in 1942 when his father died suddenly of a heart attack at 51, leaving Calvin, then 27, to come home from a job at the grain elevator in Findlay and figure out how to run 280 acres of Hardin County cropland on his own. He had been figuring it out ever since. In 16 years of farming, the land his grandfather had broken, Calvin had developed habits of observation that most men his age had never needed. He watched the sky with the attention of someone whose livelihood depended on reading it correctly. He watched his soil the way a doctor watches a patient, noting changes in color and texture, and the way water moved across it after a rain. He watched his crops from emergence to harvest, walking the rows in the evenings, when the light was low, and the shadows showed things that the midday sun flattened out. And he watched his trees. Not because he was sentimental about them. Calvin Morse was not a sentimental man. He watched them because he had learned over 16 years of watching that the 30 acres of timber on his north boundary were doing something. He could not have told you exactly what they were doing in scientific language because he had no scientific language. He had a farmer's language, which is the language of observation and consequence. He had watched what happened on the north side of his farm season after season, and he had drawn conclusions from what he saw. In winter, the trees caught snow. The drifts that built up along the south edge of the timber, the field side, were deep and persistent, lasting into March when the open fields were already bare. That snow melted slowly over weeks, and it soaked into the north fields in a way that fast-melting snow on open ground did not. The water had time to go down into the soil rather than running off across the surface toward the creek. In spring, those north fields started wet, not waterlogged, but with a moisture reserve in the root zone that the south fields, the ones with no tree protection, simply did not have. Calvin had noticed this difference years ago. He had noticed that his north field corn was taller by the 4th of July than his south field corn even in dry years. He had attributed this correctly to the moisture the trees were holding for him through the winter. In summer, the trees broke the wind. The prevailing winds in Hardin County came from the northwest off the flat Indiana farmland to the west, and they hit the timber before they hit Calvin's fields. The trees took the energy out of those winds. What came through the canopy and around the edges was slower and gentler, and less capable of pulling moisture out of the soil and the corn leaves. Calvin's north fields did not suffer from windburn the way open fields did. They stayed cooler on hot days. The corn did not curl its leaves in the afternoon heat the way corn in exposed fields did. In fall, the leaves came down, millions of them over the course of October and November, and the prevailing winds carried them out of the timber and onto the north edge of Calvin's field, where they decomposed over winter and added organic matter to the soil. Free fertilizer from a process that had been running since before the first white man ever set foot in Ohio. Calvin did not rake them up, he let them lie. He could see all of this. He could see it happening year after year in the difference between his fields and his neighbors' fields, in his yield numbers, in the color and depth of his topsoil. He could see it, but he could not quantify it in the language that the men at the Farm Bureau used, the language of dollars per acre and bushels per year and net income after equipment costs. That language belonged to other people. Calvin's language was simpler. Those trees are part of this farm. You do not cut out a part of something that is working. He had said this to Elaine, his wife, once, and she had nodded in the way she nodded when she understood something and did not need it elaborated. Elaine Morse understood more than she said, which was a quality Calvin had recognized in her when they married in 1940 and had depended on in the 18 years since. Now here is the thing about those 30 acres of timber that Calvin Morse stood at his kitchen window and looked at every morning of his life. They were not there by design. Calvin's grandfather, Harlan Morse, had homesteaded the Hardin County property in 1891, coming down from Michigan with a young wife and $40, and the kind of optimism that the American frontier seemed to manufacture in unlimited quantities in those years. Harlan was a practical man. He cleared what he could clear and planted what he could plant. He was not a man who kept trees for aesthetic reasons or ecological ones. He kept trees only when he had no better use for the ground they stood on. The north boundary of the property sat on a limestone ridge. The bedrock came up close to the surface there, in some places only 8 or 10 inches below the topsoil. You could not plow it, you could not drain it. The rocky ground made cultivation impossible with the equipment available to a homesteading farmer in 1891. So Harlan Morse left the timber standing on that ridge, not because he had a vision, not because he understood what trees did for a farm, but because the ground underneath them was useless for any other purpose. The trees had been spared by geology, not by wisdom. Calvin knew this. He had heard the story from his father, who heard it from Harlan himself. The trees were an accident, a fortunate accident as it turned out, but an accident nonetheless. And knowing this kept Calvin honest with himself in a way that might otherwise have been difficult. He could not claim that his family had possessed special foresight. He could not claim that he was smarter than his neighbors. He could only claim that he had looked carefully at what the accident of geology had left him and had chosen not to undo it. That was the whole of his position in the spring of 1958 when the chainsaws began. The man most responsible for those chainsaws was named Walt Gruber. Walt ran the John Deere dealership in Kenton, the county seat, and he had been running it since 1948. He was 50 years old in 1958, a large man with a politician's handshake and a salesman's memory for names, the kind of man who remembered not just who you were, but what equipment you were running and when you had bought it and what the next logical upgrade would be for your operation. He knew every farmer in Hardin County by name, and he knew their acreage and their debt load and their ambitions. Walt Gruber was not a dishonest man. He genuinely believed what he said. He believed it with the conviction of someone whose profession and whose ideology had merged so completely that he could no longer tell them apart. And what he believed was this: every acre of trees was an acre of lost income. Every woodlot was an obstacle. Every fence row was a problem waiting to be solved. The purpose of farmland was to produce crops, and anything that was not producing crops was by definition failing to fulfill its purpose. He made this case every Saturday morning at the Farm Bureau office on the square in Kenton, where the county's farmers gathered to drink coffee and talk about prices and weather and equipment. Walt was always there. Walt was always talking. He had the stage presence of a man who had spent 30 years selling things, which is to say he knew how to make an argument feel like common sense. You cannot farm trees, he would say. Trees are scenery. Scenery does not pay the mortgage. You want scenery, drive through a state park on Sunday afternoon. You want income, get a chainsaw and a bulldozer and put every acre you have got into production. The math was simple, he said. A mature oak tree produced 0 bushels of corn. An acre of cleared land in Hardin County produced 70 bushels at $1.10 per bushel. That was $77 per acre per year that every farmer in the county was losing for every acre of trees he kept standing. Multiply that by 30 acres of woodlot, and you had $2,300 a year in phantom income, money the trees were costing by merely existing. The argument was hard to answer with the tools most farmers had available to them, which were gut feeling and experience in the specific knowledge of their own land. Walt had numbers. Walt had the authority of commerce behind him, the weight of a successful business, the credibility of a man who had been right about agricultural economics before and could point to the evidence. He had been right about larger equipment. He had been right about hybrid seed corn. He had been right about anhydrous ammonia as a nitrogen source. His track record made him worth listening to. And backing Walt up in the winter of 1958 and 1959 was Lyle Beckett. Lyle was 28 years old and had come to Hardin County as the new county extension agent after finishing his degree in agricultural economics at Ohio State University the previous spring. He was thin and earnest and wore the kind of wire-rimmed glasses that made a young man look authoritative without looking intimidating. He believed in the land-grant mission of the Extension Service, which was to bring the latest agricultural science to the farmers who needed it, and he believed that the latest agricultural science in 1958 was pointing clearly in one direction: maximize cropland acreage. In the winter of 1959, Lyle Beckett wrote and distributed an extension bulletin that reached every farm mailbox in Hardin County. The bulletin was titled Maximizing Cropland Acreage for Increased Farm Revenue. It was 6 pages long, clearly written, full of calculations showing the economic benefit of clearing timber, draining wetlands, and removing fence rows to bring every possible acre into production. The calculations were correct given the assumptions they were built on. The assumptions were that the only thing a piece of farmland could do was produce a crop, and that anything preventing it from doing so was a cost to be eliminated. Lyle wrote it with genuine conviction. He had learned agricultural economics from serious men at a serious university, and those serious men had taught him to think about land in terms of productivity per acre. He was applying what he had been taught. He was doing his job. The bulletin was a sensation. Farmers talked about it at the bureau and at church and at the hardware store. The calculations were laid out plainly enough that any man could check the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was right. $2,300 a year in lost income for a 30-acre woodlot. That was real money in 1958. That was a tractor payment. That was a child's college education. That was the difference between making it and not making it in a decade when farm margins were already thin. The first chainsaws went to work in April of 1958 on the Lester property on the west side of the county. By June, there were crews working on 4 other farms. By the following spring, the sound that Calvin heard from his kitchen window on that Tuesday morning in April had become a regular feature of life in Hardin County, Ohio. A new kind of spring bird song, the industrial music of a county remaking itself. Calvin heard it and said nothing. He went about his planting and his cultivation and his fence maintenance and his equipment upkeep, the 10,000 tasks that fill a farmer's spring, and he said nothing about the trees. He did not go to the Saturday morning bureau meetings. He was not by nature a meeting kind of man. On Saturdays, he worked because Saturday was the same as any other day when there was work to be done and no one was going to do it for him. Word reached him, of course. Word always reached farmers in Hardin County, traveling through the web of wives and neighbors and hired men and elevator operators that connected every farm to every other farm in the county. He heard what Walt Gruber was saying on Saturday mornings. He heard that Lyle Beckett's bulletin was circulating and being discussed. He heard that Doug Fenner, whose property ran along Calvin's eastern boundary, was thinking seriously about clearing the timber on his south fields. Calvin did not respond to any of it. He went back to his fields and his fences and his evening walks through the north timber, and he let the county make its decision. Doug Fenner made his decision in the summer of 1960. Doug was 45 years old, 2 years older than Calvin, and had been farming the 400 acres of the Fenner property since his father retired in 1951. He was a good farmer in the conventional sense, meaning he was hardworking and attentive to the practical demands of running a grain operation. But he was also a man who felt the social pressure of his community acutely. He did not like being on the wrong side of the consensus. He did not like being the man who was still doing something the old way when everyone else had moved on to the new way. When Walt Gruber used Doug as an example at the Bureau that October, after Doug had hired a clearing crew and taken 40 acres of timber off his south boundary and contracted with Walt for a larger planter to work the new ground, the room was approving. The county agent nodded. The other farmers leaned forward over their coffee cups and listened to the numbers. Doug Fenner cleared his timber in 60. His corn went from 70 bushels on 360 acres to 72 bushels on 400 acres. That is an extra 2,300 bushels a year at $1.10. That is $2,500 Doug was not making before. Walt looked around the room. Calvin Morse is still out there farming around his trees like it is 1900. Somebody want to tell him the 20th century already started. The laughter was real and sustained. Calvin was not there to hear it, but he heard about it. He heard about it in the particular way of farm country, where information travels without anyone intending to carry it, finding its way to the person it concerns through a chain of conversations that no one organizes and no one stops. He heard it on a Friday afternoon from Owen, his son, who was 17 years old and had heard it from a boy at school whose father had been at the Bureau that Saturday. Owen told his father the way a teenage boy tells his father something uncomfortable, watching for the reaction, not sure what reaction to expect. Calvin listened. He nodded once. Then he asked Owen what the homework situation was for the weekend and whether the boy had checked on the water level in the stock tank that afternoon. That was the end of the conversation. But that evening after supper, Calvin put on his barn coat and walked out across the north fields toward the timber, as he did most evenings when the weather permitted. The light was going. The October sky over Ohio had gone from orange to purple to the deep blue that comes just before dark, and the timber stood black against it, the bare October branches etched against the fading light. He went in through the south gate, a gap in the fence where a cattle path ran between two large bur oaks, and followed the ridge north through the heart of the stand. The ground was rocky and uneven, covered with the deep leaf mat that 67 years of fall had laid down 6 inches of decomposed matter that smelled dark and rich and alive, the particular smell of a woods that had been left alone long enough to develop its own ecology. The oaks were magnificent in the October light. Some of them were close to 100 years old, their trunks 3 feet across their canopies spread wide in the open-grown way of trees that had room to expand. White oaks along the south edge where the sun reached, bur oaks on the ridge top where the soil was thin and the wind was strongest, their massive limbs built for force, red oaks on the slope where the moisture ran. Nobody had arranged them this way. They had arranged themselves over decades of competition and adaptation, each species finding the niche that suited it the way things that have enough time always find their place. Calvin walked through them without hurrying. He knew these trees the way a man knows the rooms of his own house by feel and habit, and the accumulated memory of 1,000 previous passes. He stopped at the big white oak on the south ridge, the one he had been measuring since he was a boy, and put his hand on the bark. The bark was deep and ridged and warm from the afternoon sun, the kind of warmth that stays in dense wood long after the air has cooled. The tree was not going to tell him anything he did not already know. He put his hand there anyway. He thought about what Walt Gruber had said. He thought about the $2,300 that the trees were supposedly costing him every year. He did the arithmetic in his head the same way he always did it when someone brought up the number, multiplying it out over the years he had been farming. 16 years since he took over from his father. 16 times 2,300. That was a lot of money presented that way, as a loss, as something taken from him by the mere presence of the trees. But he also thought about what he could see every year, which was that his north fields consistently outperformed his south fields on moisture, on wind protection, on pest pressure, on the depth and color of the topsoil. He could see the difference. He had been seeing it for 16 years. He had no way to put a dollar figure on what he was seeing because the Extension Service had not given him a formula for calculating the value of a windbreak or a moisture reserve or a natural pest suppressor. They had given him a formula for calculating the value of cleared cropland. That was the only formula they had. Calvin walked the ridge for 40 minutes as he usually did, and then came back out through the south gate and walked back across the darkened field to the house where the kitchen light was on, and Elaine had left coffee on the stove. He did not know as he walked in from the timber that October evening that his wife had been doing arithmetic of her own. Elaine Morse had started keeping a separate ledger in the winter of 1960. She did not tell Calvin about it. She did not tell anyone about it. She sat at the kitchen table on winter evenings after the supper dishes were done, and Owen was at the table with his schoolwork, and she did what she had always done, which was to keep careful track of numbers. The ledger was a small green notebook she had bought at the hardware store in Kenton for 35 cents. She kept it in the drawer behind the dish towels, which was where she kept things that were hers and not general household property. In the ledger, she wrote down what the timber provided to the Morse farm in a given year. Firewood. Calvin cut dead and fallen timber from the woodlot every November, and the wood heated the house from October through April. The alternative was fuel oil, which the Morses used minimally because of the timber. Elaine calculated the difference and wrote it down. Fence posts. When trees fell in storms, Calvin salvaged the straight sections for fence posts, rather than buying cedar or locust from the lumberyard. Elaine kept track of how many posts the woodlot provided each year and what they would have cost to purchase. Wild plums and hickory nuts. The timber's understory produced both in abundance. Elaine picked the plums in August and made jelly, which she sold at the county fair and at the farm stand on Route 31 from June through September. She harvested hickory nuts in October and sold them by the bag to a buyer in Findlay who supplied them to a bakery operation in Columbus. The income was not large, but it was consistent and it was real. Mushrooms. The fallen logs in the timber produced morel mushrooms in Mayhen of the Woods in October. Elaine harvested them, sold some dried, and stored others. She calculated their market value at wholesale rates and wrote the number down. Cattle shelter. The Morse herd wintered in the north lot, which bordered the timber. The trees broke the northwest wind before it reached the cattle, reducing their exposure and their feed requirement in cold weather. Elaine calculated the reduction in hay and feed costs that the wind protection provided and added it to the ledger. When she added the columns at the end of 1960, the total came to $1,412. She added the columns again at the end of 1961, $1,430. At the end of 1962, $1,418. The number was remarkably consistent, $1,400 give or take every year. Real money, money that went into the household accounts or reduced costs that would otherwise have to be covered from crop income. Money that Walt Gruber's calculation had not included because Walt's calculation only counted what the timber was not doing, which was growing corn. Elaine did not show the ledger to Calvin, not yet. She did not think he needed it to continue doing what he was doing, which was continuing without asking for anyone's permission or approval. Calvin Morse was not a man who needed to be told he was right in order to keep going. He was a man who watched what was in front of him and drew his own conclusions and acted on them, and no amount of Saturday morning argument from the bureau room was going to change that. But Elaine kept the ledger. She kept it because she understood something that Calvin, for all his practical intelligence, might not have fully articulated to himself. The argument that Walt Gruber was making was a numbers argument, and the only way to beat a numbers argument eventually was with better numbers. Not emotion, not instinct, not the farmer's language of observation and consequence, which was real and valid, but invisible to the people who dealt in columns and calculations. The ledger was her contribution to a fight that Calvin was fighting alone in his own way with his own tools. She was not going to hand it to him tomorrow, but she was going to keep it year after year until the day came when it would matter. By 1963, the clearing in Hardin County had accelerated dramatically. Lyle Beckett's bulletin had done its work. Walt Gruber's Saturday morning arguments had done their work. The simple economics of cleared acreage had done their work. More than 2,000 acres of timber had come down across the county in 5 years, woodlots that had stood since the Civil War era, falling to chainsaws and bulldozers. In the space of a week, the stumps pushed into burn piles, the smoke rising over the flat Ohio fields for days. Doug Fenner had his 40 new acres in full production. Walt had sold him a bigger planter to work them with, and a bigger tractor to pull the planter, and a bigger grain bin to hold the additional harvest. Doug's operation looked on paper like exactly what it was supposed to look like. More acres, more equipment, more bushels, more income. And Calvin Morse's 30 acres of timber stood untouched on the north ridge of the Morse farm, the same way they had stood for 70 years, the same way they would stand when every argument had been made and every expert had weighed in, and every neighbor had made his choice. Walt Gruber made it personal in the spring of 1963. He had sold a new four-row planter to Doug Fenner that winter, the largest planter available in the John Deere line at the time, and he was proud of the transaction and of what it represented. Doug's operation was now 400 acres of unbroken cropland. No timber, no fence rows, no wasted ground. Everything in production. Walt used Doug as his example at the Bureau that April in front of a room that included most of the farming men of the county. He laid out the numbers. He talked about Doug's yield increases. He talked about the additional income from the new acres. He talked about the logic of full production as though it were as simple and obvious as the multiplication tables. Then he looked around the room. Calvin Morse is still out there farming around his trees like it is 1890. Somebody want to tell him what year it is. The laughter came easy and comfortable. The laughter of a room that has been given permission to enjoy itself at someone else's expense. Several of the men there had been carrying some version of this thought for years, the mild contempt that communities feel for the man who refuses to do what everyone else is doing, who makes a different choice and sticks to it without apology. The laughter was a release of that feeling. It felt good in the moment. It cost nothing in the moment. Calvin was not in the room. He was home doing what he did on Saturdays, which was working. Word reached him by Thursday through the usual channels, in the usual way. Owen heard it at school as before. He told his father at supper, watching his father's face for a reaction. Calvin ate his supper. He thanked Elaine for the meal. He went out after supper and walked to the timber as he did most evenings. He entered through the south gate between the two big bur oaks and followed the ridge north in the fading April light. The trees were just coming into leaf, the pale green of new oak leaves catching what was left of the evening sun, translucent and bright against the darkening sky. He stopped at the big white oak on the south ridge and stood there for a while, one hand on the bark, listening to the birds settling in for the night in the canopy above him. The oak did not know that it had been the subject of ridicule in a room in Kenton that Saturday morning. It did not know that its owner had been called a fool, or that the county's opinion of him had been collected and expressed in a burst of easy laughter. It did not know anything about any of that. It knew in whatever way a tree knows things about the angle of the light and the temperature of the soil and the depth of its roots in the limestone ridge. It knew in whatever way a tree knows things about the work it was doing. Calvin Morse stood with his hand on the bark of a 90-year-old white oak in the last light of an April evening in 1963, and he knew what the tree knew. He walked back to the house in the dark. He did not say anything to Elaine about what he had heard. He did not need to. Elaine already knew. In the kitchen drawer behind the dish towels, the green ledger held 4 years of numbers. $1,400 a year added up 4 times a quiet argument that had not yet been made to anyone waiting with the patience of a woman who understood that the right moment had not come yet. Outside across the north fields, the timber stood in the dark as it had stood every night for 70 years doing what it did, catching whatever wind was coming, holding whatever moisture the ground would take, sheltering whatever had found shelter there. The chainsaws would run all summer. The county would continue its transformation. The smoke from burn piles would continue to rise over the flat fields of Hardin County, Ohio, marking the places where woodlots had stood and stood no longer. And Calvin Morse would continue to walk his evening rounds, hand on the bark of trees that had been left by accident and kept by intention, watching what they did, reading the land the way his grandfather had never thought to read it, the way the Extension Service had no bulletin, for the way that only comes from standing in one place long enough to see what is actually happening. In Hardin County in 1963, that made him a fool. Time would have its own opinion on the matter. The summer of 1963 was dry in Hardin County. Not catastrophically dry, not the kind of dry that makes the newspapers and the disaster relief applications, but the persistent grinding dry of a summer that withholds just enough rain to remind a farmer how thin the margin is between a good year and a bad one. Calvin Morse watched his north fields through that summer and watched his south fields and noted the difference between them, the way he always noted it, without writing it down, without telling anyone, simply carrying the information in the place where a careful man carries the things he has seen with his own eyes. The north fields, sheltered by the timber, held their moisture longer into the dry spells. The corn on the north end of the farm stood taller in August than the corn on the south end. The difference was not dramatic. It was the kind of difference that only a man who had been watching the same fields for 20 years would notice or consider significant. Calvin noticed it. He considered it significant. By the fall of 1963, the mockery had settled into something more comfortable and more permanent than active ridicule. It had become a running observation, the kind of thing that gets said at the end of a conversation about something else, almost as an afterthought, almost as punctuation. Calvin Morse still has his trees, said with a small shake of the head and a half smile, the expression reserved for a neighbor whose harmless eccentricity you have long since given up trying to correct. Doug Fenner said it at the elevator in September, weighing in his corn. The Harmon boys said it at the hardware store in October. Walt Gruber said it still at the bureau on Saturday mornings, though with less heat than before, the way a man speaks about a lost argument that he has officially moved past but not entirely forgotten. Calvin heard all of it and said nothing. Owen was 18 in 1963, in his last year of high school, and the social pressure that his father deflected without apparent effort landed on Owen with considerably more weight. Owen was the one who had to sit in classrooms with the sons of the men who laughed at his father on Saturday mornings. He was the one who heard the jokes fresh, who felt their edges before they had been worn smooth by repetition. He came home from school with a tension in his shoulders that Calvin recognized but did not directly address. Instead, Calvin did what he had done before. He took Owen to the fields. He walked Owen along the north fence line and showed him the moisture differential in the soil, digging down with a fence post rod to demonstrate the difference in depth between the wet zone and the dry zone, one on each side of the influence of the timber. He showed Owen the pest damage numbers, the corn earworm counts he had been recording informally in a notebook for years, consistently lower on the north end of the farm than on the south end or on the Fenner property. He did not tell Owen what to conclude. He showed Owen what was there and let the boy draw his own conclusions the same way Calvin had taught himself to observe, by looking at what was actually in front of him rather than at what someone else's formula said should be there. Owen looked. Owen was quiet for a while. Then he went back to school and sat in his classroom and heard the jokes and said nothing, which was the most his father could have asked of him. The years between 1963 and 1966 were years of consolidation in Hardin County. The major clearing had been done. The woodlots that were going to fall had mostly fallen. The county's agricultural landscape had been remade. The dark patches of timber that had broken up the flat geometry of the fields replaced by unbroken cropland stretching from fence row to fence row, road to road, horizon to horizon. It was a tidier landscape, a more legible one, the kind of landscape that looked productive because it was entirely organized around production. Walt Gruber had sold a great deal of equipment in those years. Larger tractors to work the larger acreage, larger planters to plant it, larger combines to harvest it, larger grain bins to store it. The arithmetic of farm equipment works the same way as the arithmetic of farm acreage, each expansion creating the logical necessity for the next expansion, each new piece of equipment justifying its cost only if there were enough acres to work it efficiently. Doug Fenner had bought all of it. His operation was now fully configured for the 400 acres he was farming. The equipment matched to the acreage the way a machine is matched to the job it was designed for. On paper, in the winter of 1965, the Fenner operation looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. More acres, more equipment, more capacity, more output. On paper. What the paper did not show was something that would take years to become visible, the way certain kinds of damage always take years to become visible. The cleared land on the south end of the Fenner property, the 40 acres that had been timber and was now cropland, had been losing topsoil since the first season after clearing. Not dramatically, not in the dusty visible clouds of a true wind erosion event, but consistently in the way that water moving over stone removes it a little at a time, imperceptibly in any given year, unmistakably over a decade. The northwest winds that had previously exhausted themselves against the Fenner timber now crossed the cleared ground without resistance. The topsoil, that dark Hardin County silt loam that had taken thousands of years to build, was moving. A fine invisible drift of particles in every wind settling in fence rows and road ditches and low spots in the field. A few ounces per acre per windstorm, a few pounds per season, a few tons per decade. Nobody measured it. Nobody was measuring it. Calvin Morse noticed it. He noticed the way the color of the soil on Doug's cleared land was changing almost imperceptibly from the dark brown of productive ground to something slightly lighter, slightly less rich. He noticed it in the way he noticed everything, by comparing it to what he had seen before, by trusting the evidence of his own eyes over the evidence of anyone else's calculations. He did not say anything about it to Doug. He and Doug were neighbors in the Hardin County sense, which meant they were civil at the elevator and at the bureau and at church, and they helped each other occasionally in the practical ways that neighbors help each other, but they were not close in the way that would have made an observation like that possible without offense. And Calvin was not in any case a man who offered opinions that had not been asked for. He kept watching. He kept noting. He kept walking the north timber in the evenings, 40 minutes from the south gate to the north boundary, and back watching the trees do their work. The winter of 1966 was the hardest winter Calvin Morse had as a farmer. It was not the weather. The winter itself was ordinary cold and gray and long in the way that Ohio winters are long, but not exceptional. The hardship was financial. A combination of factors that year, a lower than expected corn price at harvest, an unexpected repair cost on the combine that ate into the cash reserve, a property tax reassessment that added to the winter expenses, had left the Morse operation with less cushion than Calvin was comfortable with going into the new year. He sat with the numbers in December. He spread the ledgers on the kitchen table after supper and went through them the way he went through them every winter, looking for the places where things could be tightened, looking for the story the numbers were telling. The story they were telling in December of 1966 was not catastrophic, but it was uncomfortable. The operation was solvent. It would remain solvent, but the margin was thinner than it had been in years, and thin margins made a man think about the things he could change. The thing he could change, the obvious thing, the thing that every man in the county had been telling him for 8 years he should change, was the 30 acres of timber on the North Ridge. He thought about it for 3 weeks. He thought about it the way he thought about important things, without talking about it, turning it over in his mind during the long silences of winter farm work, examining it from different angles, testing the logic of it against the evidence he had accumulated over 24 years of farming the same ground. He ran the numbers the way Walt Gruber had always run them. $2,300 per year in lost corn income. At the current corn price, slightly higher than that. Real money. Money the farm genuinely needed if the numbers were to be believed. In January, he made a phone call. A clearing crew out of Findlay, recommended by one of the Harmon boys who had used them the previous spring for a small woodlot on the east end of his property. Calvin spoke to the foreman on the phone and arranged for the crew to come out and walk the property and give him an estimate. The crew came on a Thursday afternoon in late January. There were 3 men, the foreman, and 2 workers, and they walked the North Ridge with Calvin looking at the timber the way men look at timber when they are thinking about cutting it, measuring trunk diameters with a tape, looking up at the canopy, kicking at roots, and assessing the difficulty of stump removal on the rocky ground. They were efficient and professional, and they gave Calvin a number that was reasonable. Calvin thanked them. He said he would call them in the next week. That evening, he went to the timber. It was full dark by 5 in the afternoon in late January in Ohio, and the night was clear and cold. The temperature down around 15 degrees of a light wind from the northwest moving through the canopy with a sound like distant water. Calvin had a flashlight, but he did not use it. He knew the path well enough to walk it without light, had walked it enough times in enough kinds of dark that his feet knew where to go. He went in through the south gate and stood for a moment letting his eyes adjust. The stars were out, and there was enough light from them and from the snow on the ground to see the shapes of the big trees against the sky, the massive columns of the bur oaks on the ridge top, the spreading canopy of the white oak on the south slope. And then he saw the snow. He had seen it before. He had seen it every winter for 24 years. But he had not been looking for it before the way he was looking for it now, with the question of the timber's future sitting live and unresolved in his chest. The snow had drifted deep along the south edge of the woodlot, the field edge the way it always did. The wind that came from the northwest hit the canopy and was deflected upward and came down again on the south side of the trees, depositing its snow load in long, curved drifts that followed the line of the timber for the entire length of the north boundary. The drifts were 3 feet deep in places. In the open field to the south of them, where the wind had moved unimpeded, the snow was 4 inches deep, wind-packed and hard. 3 feet of stored moisture in the drifts along the timber edge, 4 inches in the open field. That 3 feet of snow would melt in March and April. It would melt slowly over weeks, held in place by the shade of the canopy, even after the open field snow was gone. It would soak into the north end of Calvin's cornfield at the rate the soil could absorb it, which was the right rate, not the rate of surface runoff that left standing water in the low spots and carried topsoil toward the creek. Calvin stood in the cold dark looking at the drifts for a long time. He walked the ridge to the north boundary and back. He stood under the white oak with his hand on the bark. The bark cold now. January cold, the warmth of the afternoon sun long gone. He stood there until he was thoroughly cold himself, until his hands in their gloves were numb, and his breath was making clouds in the flashlight beam. Then he walked back to the house. In the morning, he did not call the clearing crew. He did not call them the next day either or the day after that. He paid the property tax bill from the operating account and tightened what could be tightened in the winter budget and went into the spring of 1967 with the timber still standing and the margin still thin and the decision behind him without having been formally made. He never told Elaine about the phone call. He never told anyone. But the timber stood, and in March the snow melted into the north fields the way it always had, and by May the corn on the north end of the farm was showing the moisture advantage that Calvin had been watching accumulate for 2 decades, and by July he had put the winter's financial discomfort behind him, and by harvest the numbers were better, and the ledger balanced again, and the green notebook behind Elaine's dish towels had another year's worth of calculations added to it, $1,427 for the year 1967. The late 1960s brought something new to Hardin County that nobody had been specifically watching for because nobody had thought to watch for it. The Soil Conservation Service office in Kenton began receiving reports in 1968, tentative and uncertain at first, from farmers on the cleared ground. Reports of pale streaks in their fields, of soil collecting in fence rows that had not had soil collected in them before, of a gradual, subtle change in the color of the ground on the acres that had been under timber a decade earlier. The SCS man in Kenton was a careful, methodical technician named Harold Voss, who had been with the service for 15 years and knew Hardin County soil the way a doctor knows a familiar patient. Harold drove out to the farms that had called in the reports and looked at what was being described, and what he saw confirmed what he suspected. The cleared fields were losing topsoil. Not dramatically, not in quantities that would show up clearly in a single season's yield numbers, but measurably consistently at a rate that his training told him would matter significantly over time. He wrote a report. The report went to the district office in Columbus. The district office acknowledged receipt and filed it. Nothing changed. Lyle Beckett, the county extension agent, received a copy of Harold Voss's report. He read it carefully. He read it more than once. He drove out himself to 3 of the farms Harold had cited and looked at what Harold had described, and he saw what Harold had seen: the lighter color on the cleared ground, the subtle changes in soil texture that indicated organic material loss, the patterns in the field that told the story of wind moving across unprotected ground. He drove back to his office in Kenton and sat at his desk for a long time. What he wanted to do was write a follow-up bulletin, a correction to the 1959 document. A careful, scientifically framed acknowledgement that the original economic analysis had been incomplete, that it had counted the costs of keeping timber without counting the benefits, and that the evidence now accumulating in Hardin County suggested the original recommendation needed to be revisited. He picked up the phone and called the district office in Columbus. The conversation was not long. The man he spoke to, a senior administrator, whose name Lyle would remember for the rest of his life, was patient and not unkind, but clear. If the Extension Service issued a formal retraction of the 1959 bulletin, the legal implications for the state were significant. Farmers who had cleared timber on the recommendation of that bulletin and subsequently suffered crop losses from erosion could have grounds for a claim against the state. The legal office had looked at the question. The answer was no. The bulletin would not be retracted. The Extension Service would not issue a correction. Lyle Beckett put the phone down and sat at his desk in Kenton, Ohio in the fall of 1970 with a knowledge he was not permitted to act on. He had gone out and looked at the farms and seen the evidence and known with the certainty of a trained professional looking at the consequences of his own published advice that he had been wrong. The 1959 tin had been wrong. The recommendation had been incomplete. The clearing had caused damage that was only now becoming visible. He knew this and was not allowed to say so. He sat with it. He continued to do his job. He helped farmers with the practical questions of the day, the ones that had nothing to do with the 1959 bulletin, the ones about seed selection and fertilizer timing and equipment maintenance. He did not mention the erosion reports. He did not mention the conversation with Columbus. He did not mention Calvin Morse, whose north fields he had observed on a quiet drive past the property one afternoon remained dark and moist and apparently unconcerned with the problems developing on the cleared ground around him. He filed Harold Voss's report in a drawer and kept it there. He would keep it there for more than 20 years. Calvin Morse knew none of this. He did not know about Harold Voss's report or Lyle Beckett's phone call to Columbus or the legal calculation that had silenced the one man in the county with the professional standing to say out loud what Calvin had been saying with his behavior for 12 years. He did not know any of it because none of it was told to him or to anyone outside the system that had produced and then suppressed it. What he knew was what he could see. And what he could see in the early 1970s was that the cleared fields in the county were changing. He could see it at Doug Fenner's property most clearly because Doug's land bordered his on the east, and Calvin had 16 years of visual reference for what Doug's south fields had looked like before the clearing. He drove past Doug's place on the county road, and he could see the difference in the color of the soil on the cleared acreage versus the older farmland that had never been timber. The cleared ground was lighter. Not dramatically lighter, not the pale sandy color of truly exhausted soil, but lighter than it had been, lighter than the Hardin County silt loam was supposed to be lighter, in the way that tells a man who knows soil that something has been removed that is not coming back quickly. Doug Fenner could see it too. He did not know what to make of it. In 1972, Doug's yield on the cleared south acres was down 2 bushels per acre from the previous year. In 1973, it was down another bushel and a half. He attributed the first dip to weather. He attributed the second dip to the new seed variety he had tried and then abandoned. He bought more fertilizer. He bought more chemical inputs. He bought a new planter with more precise seed placement on the advice of Walt Gruber, who suggested that precision planting would recover the yield gap. Walt Gruber was still selling equipment. The equipment solved some problems and not others, and the ones it did not solve required more equipment, which Walt also sold. It was a good time to be a John Deere dealer in Northwest Ohio, even as the farms around you began to show in their topsoil color and their moisture retention and their creeping yield decline on the most vulnerable acres, the first evidence of a long and slow unraveling. The wells were changing too. This was something that the farmers on the cleared land noticed before they noticed the soil color, because the wells were more immediately connected to daily life than the color of soil in a distant field. The shallow wells that served the farmsteads, the 20 and 30-foot wells that tapped the perched water table, sitting on the clay pan beneath the topsoil, were dropping. Not dramatically, not enough to run dry in a normal year, but measurably consistently, a foot or 18 inches lower in their casings than they had been a decade before. The trees had been cycling water. They had been pulling it up from deep in the soil profile and releasing it through their leaves into the air above the canopy, where it contributed to local humidity and eventually to local precipitation. Without the trees, that cycle was broken. Less transpiration, less local moisture in the air, less precipitation falling back on the land that had generated it. The aquifer was recharging more slowly than it had when the timber was standing. Calvin's wells did not drop. His timber was still cycling water the way it had always cycled it. The spring on the north end of the property, which emerged from the limestone ridge and ran year-round into a stock tank below the timber, had not changed its flow rate in 20 years. He noticed the other farmers talking about their wells in the early 70s. He heard it at the elevator, the casual complaints about pump depth and water pressure, the theories about drought cycles and aquifer behavior. He noticed that the complaints came primarily from farms where the timber had been cleared. He filed this observation in the same place he filed all his observations, in the careful private record he kept in his own mind, and he said nothing. In 1974, Elaine put the green notebook on the kitchen table. It was a November evening supper, cleared Owen off with his wife in the house they had built on the south end of the property the previous year, the farmhouse quiet, with the particular quiet of a house where children have grown and gone, and left behind a silence that is not entirely unwelcome. Calvin was at the table with the winter ledgers doing what he always did in November, going through the year's numbers and preparing for the year ahead. Elaine came from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him and placed the green notebook between them on the table. Calvin looked at it. He looked at Elaine. She said 14 years, every year since 1960. I have been keeping track of what the timber gives us. Firewood fence posts, the wild plums, and the hickory nuts, the mushrooms, the cattle shelter. Every year it comes to between $1,400 and $1,450. Real money. Money we have had and not had to earn any other way. She paused. I thought you should know I have been keeping this, not because you need it to keep doing what you are doing. I know you do not need it for that. But because someday someone is going to ask you for a number and I wanted you to have one. Calvin picked up the notebook. He turned through it slowly, page by page, reading the columns. 14 years of consistent, careful accounting, Elaine's precise handwriting in blue ink, the totals at the bottom of each year's page, the running cumulative at the back. He read it all the way through. He set it back on the table. He picked up his coffee and drank from it and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I did not know you were doing this. She said, I know. He said, thank you. And then he said, I do not need it to keep going. But I need to know you have been here with me. She took the notebook back and put it in her coat pocket, and he understood that she would keep it where she kept it, where it had always been ready for the day when it would serve its purpose, which was not today and was not any day soon, but which was coming. He went back to his ledgers. She went back to the kitchen. Outside, the November wind moved through the timber on the north ridge, the bare branches clicking against each other in the dark, the deep leaf mat on the ground holding what the season had put there, waiting for spring to release it back into the soil in the form that roots could use. The year 1975 was ordinary. The year 1976 was ordinary. The county continued its slow, largely unexamined transition. The cleared fields continued their slow, largely unexamined decline. Walt Gruber continued to sell equipment. Lyle Beckett continued to answer questions about seed selection and fertilizer timing. Harold Voss at the SCS continued to file reports that went to Columbus and were acknowledged and filed. Doug Fenner's cleared South acres were producing 68 bushels per acre in 1976, down from 72 in 1962. The decline was slow enough that it could always be attributed to something other than what it was. The weather, the seed, the market-driven decisions about input costs. There was always another explanation available. The real explanation, the one that was not available because it required looking backward over 15 years and connecting things that nobody had officially connected, was that the topsoil that had been building on that ground since the last ice age was leaving it and had been leaving it since the day the trees came down. Calvin looked at the number on his own combine in 1976. 75 bushels per acre on the north fields, 68 on the south, 7 bushels of difference on fields that were otherwise similar in soil type and management. The 7-bushel difference was the timber. He wrote the number in his notebook. He had been writing the number in his notebook for 14 years. The spring of 1977 arrived, and with it something that Hardin County had not seen in a generation. The rain stopped, not all at once. It stopped the way drought always stops, gradually, the spaces between rains growing longer, the amounts when it did rain growing smaller, the sky offering the promise of moisture, and then withholding it day after day through May and into June through June and into July through July and into August, 40% less rainfall than the average, enough to matter in ways that nothing else that year mattered. Calvin watched the sky the way he always watched it. He watched his soil. He walked his fields in the evenings, pushing a probe into the ground at intervals, measuring the moisture depth, comparing it to what he had seen in previous dry years, comparing his north fields to his south fields, comparing the Morse farm to the Fenner farm on the other side of the fence. The north fields held moisture deeper into the drought than the south fields. The timber was doing what the timber had always done. The snow it had caught the previous winter was long gone, but the organic matter in the soil on the north end of the farm, built up over decades by the leaf fall from the woodlot, was holding water the way a sponge holds water, releasing it slowly to the root zone rather than allowing it to evaporate from the surface. The Fenner ground on the other side of the east fence was telling a different story. By July, Doug Fenner's cleared South acres were showing stress that was visible from the county road. The corn was shorter than it should have been at that time of year, the leaves beginning to roll in the afternoon heat. The root zone dried to a depth that the crop could not compensate for. The soil on the cleared acres was pale in the summer light, the organic matter that holds moisture and color long depleted from the years of wind erosion that nobody had officially measured and nobody had officially named. On Calvin's side of the fence, the corn on the north end of his farm stood tall and green, the leaves flat and full in the morning light. The timber stood behind it on the ridge, doing what it had always done, breaking the northwest wind before it reached the crop, keeping the surface temperature lower by a few degrees, preserving the moisture in the root zone by reducing the evaporative demand. By the end of July, it was clear that 1977 was going to be a defining year for Hardin County agriculture. The drought was not going to break before the corn made its final push to fill the ears. Whatever moisture was in the soil by the first week of August was what the crop was going to have to finish on. There would be no recovery rain in time to make a difference. The combines would tell the story that the summer had written. Calvin knew what his story was going to say because he had been reading it since May, walking his fields every evening, reading the moisture levels and the crop development, and the evidence of what the timber was doing on the north end of his farm. He did not know yet exactly what Doug Fenner's story was going to say. He would find out in August when the combine started. And what he found out then would be the answer to a question that had been running in Hardin County since the spring of 1958, when the chainsaws first started, and Walt Gruber first stood up at the Farm Bureau on a Saturday morning and told the county what the math said trees were costing them. The math had been running for 19 years. In August of 1977, the math was going to show its full answer, not the answer Walt had calculated, not the answer Lyle Beckett had published in his 1959 bulletin. The full answer, the one that counted everything, the one that included what the trees had been doing while everyone was looking at what they were not doing. Calvin Morse walked his north fields on a July evening in 1977, 62 years old, the same age his father had been when his heart gave out, and he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel for 19 years, which was the quiet private certainty that he had been right. He had not been right because he was smarter than Walt Gruber, or more educated than Lyle Beckett, or more virtuous than Doug Fenner. He had been right because he had stood in one place and watched carefully for a long time, and the thing he had been watching had been doing exactly what he had watched it do year after year in the privacy of seasons that kept no official record and answered to no extension bulletin. The timber stood on the north ridge in the July heat, green and still and immovable, the canopy throwing its shadow across the edge of the cornfield, the roots going down into the limestone 30 feet below the surface, the leaf litter on the ridge floor holding its moisture against the drought, the birds in the canopy doing what the birds in the canopy had always done. Everything was in place. The answer was almost here. The combines came out in the second week of August. In a normal year, August was too early for harvest in Hardin County. The corn needed September, needed the slow accumulation of heat units through the back end of summer to finish filling the ears and dry down to a moisture level the elevator would accept without excessive drying charges. In a normal year, the combine sat in the machine sheds through August and came out in late September, sometimes early October. The fields golden and ready, the air carrying that particular smell of dry corn husks and cut stalks that meant the year was closing. 1977 was not a normal year. The corn on the stressed ground had given up in late July. When a corn plant runs out of water before the ears are filled, it makes a decision that is not really a decision, a biological response to impossible conditions, and it shunts whatever energy it has left into the seed rather than the stalk, trying to preserve the genetics, even as the plant itself fails. The stalks went down first on the cleared ground, bent and broken by the August winds that crossed the unprotected fields without anything to slow them. The ears were short, 4 inches, 5 inches on the worst ground, half filled the kernels, small and light, worth almost nothing at the elevator, because the test weight was so far below standard that the drying and blending costs would eat most of the price. Doug Fenner cut his cleared south acres in the second week of August because he had no reason to wait. There was nothing more coming. The crop had finished what it was going to finish, and leaving it standing only increased the risk of stalk rot and further lodging. He ran his combine through those 40 acres in a day and a half, and the yield monitor told him a number that he did not immediately believe, and then ran again in his head until he had to believe it. 47 bushels per acre on the cleared ground. He had been averaging 68 on that ground the previous 3 years, which was already down from the 72 he had gotten in the first years after clearing, which was already lower than the 70 he had been getting on the older ground before the clearing. 47 was not a drought year yield. 47 was a disaster yield. 47 was the number that came out of ground that had been quietly failing for 15 years and had finally run out of reserves to draw on when the drought came, and the reserves were the only thing standing between the crop and a catastrophe. He moved the combine to the older ground, the fields that had never been timber, and the number was better. 61 bushels, still below average, still the damage of a drought year, but recognizable as a drought year number, rather than as something else, something more permanent and more troubling. He sat in the cab of the combine on the older ground and looked east toward the fence line that ran between his property and the Morse farm. The corn on the other side of that fence was still standing. Calvin Morse had not cut yet. Calvin's corn was still in the field in the second week of August, still green enough at the base, still carrying enough moisture in the stalks that there was no reason to hurry. Calvin had walked his north fields every evening through July and August, the same way he had walked them every evening for 25 years, reading the moisture levels, reading the crop development, reading the difference between what the timber was doing for the north end of his farm and what the absence of timber was doing for everyone else. He cut his north fields in the last week of August. He ran the combine through the rows that bordered the timber first, the rows that had spent the whole season in the morning shadow of the oak canopy, the rows that had drawn their moisture from soil enriched by 67 years of leaf fall, the rows that had been protected from the northwest wind by 30 acres of living windbreak that no county extension bulletin had ever calculated the value of. 78 bushels per acre. In the worst drought year Hardin County had seen since the 1930s, Calvin Morse's north fields produced 78 bushels per acre. The county average on unprotected cleared ground was 51. The average on the limited acreage that still had some tree protection was 74. Calvin's north fields were 4 bushels above even that. His south fields, which had no timber protection, came in at 69, which was still 18 bushels above the cleared ground average on the Fenner property, and spoke to the deeper, older soil of the Morse farm that had never been disturbed by clearing. The numbers moved through Hardin County the way numbers always move faster than anything else carried from elevator to elevator and farm to farm and kitchen table to kitchen table in the days after harvest. Every farmer in the county knew every other farmer's yield within a week of combining. It was not gossip exactly, it was information. It was the kind of information that farming communities have always shared because the margin between making it and not making it is thin enough that nobody can afford to be uninformed. The numbers told a story that did not require interpretation. Calvin Morse did not go to the Farm Bureau on the Saturday after his harvest numbers became known in the county. He went on a Saturday in late September, a month after combining because there was equipment maintenance to do that week that he had been putting off and it could not be put off any longer. He went because he had business at the elevator. He went because he needed to pick up a part at the hardware store. He did not go to receive anything from anyone. That was not why he went. He went for the same reasons he had always gone or not gone, the practical reasons, the reasons connected to the actual work of running the farm. But the room was different when he walked into the bureau that Saturday morning. The difference was in the quality of the silence when he came through the door. Not a dramatic silence, not the silence of a room that has been talking about someone and suddenly stops. A subtler silence, the silence of men who have been carrying something and are not sure what to do with it in the presence of the person it concerns. Several of the men there had been using Calvin as a negative example for 19 years. Several of the men there had laughed at the jokes Walt Gruber made about Calvin's trees at this same counter, in this same room in the years when the jokes seemed harmless and the trees seemed irrelevant. The numbers had made the jokes into something else, not into crimes, not into injuries that required acknowledgement or apology, but into something that sat in the room with a weight that had not been there before. Calvin poured himself a cup of coffee and talked about the drought and the yields in the plain informational way that farmers talk about those things. He did not raise the subject of the timber. He did not refer to anything that had been said in previous years. He drank his coffee and finished his conversation and went to the elevator and then to the hardware store and then home. The room was changed. He could feel it. He had earned something in that room not through argument or persuasion or confrontation, but through the patience of 19 years and the evidence of one drought summer. Doug Fenner came to the fence line in late August. This was after his combining was done and his numbers were in, and he had had 2 weeks to sit with them. He came on a Thursday evening when the light was going low and the shadow of Calvin's timber stretched long across the cornfield on the Morse side of the fence. Calvin saw him from the field and walked over. The two men stood on opposite sides of the fence wire in the evening light and looked at what was in front of them. On Doug's side, the pale, exhausted soy of the cleared south acres, the short stubble of a failed crop. The ground that had once been dark and deep and was now the color of old cardboard. On Calvin's side, the dark soil of the north field, the cut stalks still rich in color, the leaf mat visible at the edge of the timber where it spilled onto the field, and behind it the woodlot itself, the oaks, still holding their summer leaves in the late August warmth. Doug looked at all of it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Your timber held." Calvin said it did what it always does. Doug said I should not have cleared mine. Calvin looked out over his field and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say to that. No version of you were not alone, or everyone thought the same thing that would help Doug Fenner or change what had happened to his South Acres. The truth was too large and too permanent for comfort. The topsoil that had left Doug's cleared ground was not coming back in any time frame that was relevant to Doug's farming life. The organic matter was gone. The moisture retention was gone. The wind protection that the timber had provided was gone. Doug knew all of this. He did not need Calvin to tell him. They stood at the fence until the light was nearly gone. Then Doug nodded once and walked back to his truck and drove home. Calvin stood at the fence alone for a few minutes longer, looking at the line between the two properties. The line that was also a line between two decisions made 15 years earlier. Two sets of consequences playing out in the soil color, in the yield numbers, in the empty grain bins on one side and the full ones on the other. Then he walked back to the house. In the spring of 1979, a truck Calvin did not recognize pulled into the driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. The man who got out was 60 years old, well-dressed for a man who had been driving county roads with the careful assessing eyes of someone who had spent a professional lifetime looking at timber and knowing what he was looking at. His name was Ed Carver. He ran a hardwood buying operation out of Cedar Rapids. He had been driving Hardin County for 2 days scouting for mature oak and walnut for the furniture market, which was booming in 1979 on the strength of export demand that had tripled hardwood prices in 3 years. He had driven 200 miles of county road in those 2 days and found almost nothing worth stopping for. The county had been cleared. The woodlots were gone. The stumps were rotting in the fields where they had been bulldozed and burned. What remained was scattered and picked over and too young and too small to be of interest to a buyer looking for the premium furniture-grade stock that the market was demanding. Then he had come over the rise on the county road that ran along the north boundary of the Morse property and stopped his truck. He stood on the road and looked at the timber for 5 minutes before he drove into the driveway. Calvin came out from the barn when he heard the truck. Carver introduced himself. He explained what he was looking for. Then he said, "Mr. Morse, I have been buying timber in this part of Ohio for 22 years. I have not seen a stand like this in this county in a long time. Not because there is anything unusual about these trees, but because trees like this are not supposed to still be standing here." Calvin said they have been standing since my grandfather's time. Carver asked permission to walk the wood lot. He was in the timber for nearly 3 hours. Calvin watched him go in and did not follow. He had things to do in the afternoon, and he trusted the woodlot to make its own case. He went back to the barn and finished what he had been doing and came in for supper at the usual time, and Carver was still out there when the light started going. He came out through the south gate at 6:30 with mud on his boots and a notebook full of measurements. He sat at Calvin's kitchen table and went through his calculations while Elaine poured coffee, and when he was finished, he looked up and said his number. $180,000 for a selective harvest. 40% of the mature timber chosen for quality and diameter, leaving the rest standing for regrowth. $180,000 at 1979 prices for less than half the trees. Calvin sat with the number. Carver said I should tell you something else. He paused. I came to this farm once before, in the spring of 1964. I was driving the county that year, same purpose, looking for mature hardwood. I knocked on your door, and your wife answered, and you came out, and I told you what I was looking for, and made an offer for a look at the timber. Calvin said, I remember. Carver said, you sent me away. You told me you were not interested in having the timber evaluated. Calvin said, I remember that too. What Carver did not know, and what Calvin had never told anyone, was why he had sent the timber buyer away in 1964. It had not been because he was certain he did not want to sell. It had been because he was not certain of anything in 1964, because 1964 had been a hard year for the farm, and Walt Gruber had been at his loudest, and the pressure from every direction had been at its peak, and Calvin had not fully trusted himself to have a conversation about selling the timber without being vulnerable to the argument. He had sent Carver away in 1964 because he had known in some honest part of himself that the conversation might have gone a different way than he wanted it to go, and the timber was too important to risk on a conversation held in the wrong year. He had protected the timber from himself in 1964. Carver's $180,000 in 1979 was the reward for that protection. Calvin understood this clearly, sitting at his kitchen table doing the arithmetic in his head. Walt Gruber's number had been $2,300 per year. 21 years of keeping the timber from 1958 to 1979 at $2,300 per year was $48,300 in supposed lost income. Carver was offering $180,000 for 40% of what was standing. The trees were worth nearly 4 times what the corn would have been, and 60% of them were still standing, and the 60% that remained would continue to do everything the timber had always done. The snow catch and the windbreak and the moisture retention and the pest control and the organic matter, all of it continuing, all of it providing the same benefits it had provided for 21 years, year after year, without a paycheck, without a bulletin, without anyone counting it in the official record of what the Morse farm produced. Calvin did not sell in 1979. He thanked Ed Carver for his time and his assessment and told him he would think about it. Carver left his card and drove back to Cedar Rapids, and Calvin put the card in the drawer with the farm documents and thought about it through the fall and the winter. What he was thinking about was not whether to sell. He was thinking about when. The furniture market was strong in 1979, but the indicators that Calvin followed the same careful attention to patterns that he applied to his fields suggested it might get stronger before it leveled. He waited. He watched the hardwood prices in the farm papers the way he watched the corn price, tracking the movement, reading the trend. He called Ed Carver in the spring of 1982. The price per board foot had risen another 30% in 3 years. Carver came back to the farm and they renegotiated in the selective harvest that took 30% of the mature timber rather than 40%, brought Calvin Morse $212,000 in the summer of 1982. Owen ran the combine that fall. The timber looked almost unchanged. The selective harvest had taken the largest and most valuable trees, the ones that were ready, and left the rest. And within 3 growing seasons, the gaps in the canopy had largely closed as the younger trees moved into the light. The snow catch continued. The windbreak continued. The leaf fall continued. The birds continued their work in the canopy and in the adjacent cornfield. The $212,000 retired every debt the Morse farm had ever carried. It paid for the new barn that Owen had needed for 3 years. It paid for the education of Owen's children, Calvin's grandchildren, who would grow up on the farm without the weight of debt that most farming families in Hardin County carried as a permanent condition. It paid for something else as well, something that did not show up in any financial ledger. It paid for the knowledge, quiet and complete, that Calvin had been right. Not in the way of a man who has won an argument, in the way of a man who has done a thing correctly for a long time and watched the doing of it produce the result that the doing deserved. There is a satisfaction in that kind of rightness that has nothing to do with other people's acknowledgement of it. Walt Gruber came to the farm that fall. Walt had sold the dealership in 1979 to a dealer group from Lima and retired to a house on the west side of Kenton. He was 71 years old and had been watching the drought of 1977 and its aftermath and the timber sale and all the rest of it from the comfortable distance of retirement, and something in him had needed to come. He drove out on a Thursday afternoon in October when the timber was at its full fall color, the oaks going rust and copper, and the hickories yellow, the whole 30 acres lit up against the October sky the way the Hardin County timber had always lit up in October before most of it was gone. Calvin was in the woodlot when Walt arrived. Elaine sent Walt out through the south gate, and he walked the path north until he found Calvin standing at the big white oak on the south ridge, the one that was more than 90 years old now, its trunk 4 feet across his canopy, throwing shade over a quarter-acre of ground. The two men had not spoken directly in years. They had been in the same rooms together and exchanged the civil acknowledgments of men who share a community, but not a friendship, and that had been the extent of it. Walt looked at the tree Calvin was standing beside. He looked up at the canopy. He looked out at the fields beyond the woodlot, the dark soil, the clean-cut stubble, no erosion, no pale streaking, nothing but the deep color of ground that had been properly maintained for 40 years. He said, "I told everyone in this county to cut their trees." Calvin said, "You did." Walt said, "I told them trees were scenery. I told them scenery does not pay the mortgage." Calvin waited. Walt said, "I sold Doug Fenner a bigger planter and a bigger tractor to farm the ground he cleared. His yields on that ground are down 20 bushels from where they were before he cut. He is worse off now than he was in '58, and he spent $15,000 on equipment to get there." Calvin said, "I know that." Walt said, "And your trees are worth $200,000, and your yields are the best in the township, and your soil is the deepest in the county." Calvin said, "I know that too." Walt stood quiet for a moment. The October wind moved through the canopy above them, the dry leaves rustling and clicking, the sound of a woodlot in late season. Then he said, "How did you know, Calvin? How did you know not to cut when everyone was telling you to clear? The county agent, the extension service, me, every farmer within 10 miles of you." Calvin put his hand on the bark of the white oak. The bark was warm in the afternoon sun, the deep ridges of it familiar under his palm, in the way that things touched 10,000 times become familiar. He said, "I did not know the timber price was going to go where it went. I did not know the drought was coming in '77. I did not even know the science of it, the wind protection, the snow catch, the way the roots cycle water. I learned those words later. I did not have them in '58. Walt said, "Then why?" Calvin said, "Because I watched. I spent 16 years watching these trees before you started telling me to cut them. And what I saw was that the north end of this farm worked because the trees were part of it. The snow melted into my field because of these trees. The wind did not blow my soil because of these trees. The birds kept my corn clean because of these trees. I could see it happening every year. I could see it." He looked at Walt. "You told me to cut them, but you never asked me what they were doing. You only asked what they were not doing, which was growing corn. If you had asked what they were doing, you might have gotten a different answer." Walt did not say anything for a long time. He stood under the white oak and looked at the canopy and at the fields and at the October sky over Hardin County. The sky that was the same sky it had always been, indifferent to the arguments that had been made beneath it and the decisions that had been made and the consequences that had followed the decisions. Then he said, "I sold equipment. Every woodlot that came down was more acres that needed planting and harvesting with machines I sold. I believed what I said, but I also had a reason to believe it." Calvin took his hand off the bark. He said, "I know that." Walt drove back to Kenton. Calvin walked the rest of the ridge and came out through the south gate in the late afternoon light and went into supper. He did not tell Elaine everything that had been said. He told her Walt had come and they had talked. She nodded in the way she nodded when she understood more than she had been told, which was most of the time, and she put his supper on the table and they ate together in the kitchen with the October light going down over the fields. Elaine Morse died in the spring of 1995 on an April morning when the redbud trees along the county road were in flower and the north fields were wet with snowmelt from the timber. At the service, Owen stood up and told a story that most of the people in the room had not heard. He held the green notebook, the small cloth-covered ledger from the hardware store in Kenton, now 45 years old, the pages soft with handling and age. He said that in the winter of 1960, when Calvin was 45 years old and the pressure to clear the timber was at its most intense, Elaine Morse had begun to keep a separate set of books. She had spent 14 years recording the firewood and the fence posts and the wild plums and the hickory nuts and the mushrooms in the cattle shelter. Year after year, adding the columns, keeping the total, $1,400 a year for 35 years. More than $49,000 in real goods and real savings that had never appeared in any official farm income report, never been counted in any extension, service calculation, never been entered into the county agricultural record. Owen said my father kept the trees because he could see what they were doing for this farm. My mother kept the books that proved it. He paused. Dad watched the trees. Mom counted the benefits. Between the two of them, they outthought every expert in this county for 30 years. Calvin was in the front pew. He did not look around the room. He looked at his hands, which were folded in his lap, the hands of an 80-year-old man who had spent 60 years doing physical work and all weather-wide and calloused and marked with the specific injuries of a farming life. The room was quiet when Owen sat down. Lyle Beckett wrote his letter in the fall of 1993. He was 70 years old and had been retired from the Extension Service for 8 years, and he had been carrying the knowledge of Harold Voss's erosion reports and the phone call to Columbus in the 23 years of enforced silence for longer than he could comfortably carry it anymore. He sat at his desk at home and wrote 4 pages in longhand, careful and complete, and mailed them to the Hardin County Extension Office. The letter said that in 1959, he had recommended that farmers in the county clear their timber for additional cropland. He said that in 1970, he had seen the evidence of the consequences of that recommendation and had wanted to issue a correction and had been prevented from doing so by the legal concerns of the state agricultural department. He named the administrator he had spoken to. He described the conversation. He said that the economic analysis he had performed in 1959 was incomplete because it counted what the timber was not producing and did not count what the timber was providing. He said that Calvin Morse had understood this when he did not, and that he wished he had listened to what Calvin's behavior was saying rather than to the textbook that had shaped his own recommendations. He said he was wrong. He said it plainly without qualification in the kind of language that does not soften what it is trying to say. The letter was published in the County Extension newsletter. It was the first time in Ohio Extension Service history that a county agent had publicly retracted an agricultural recommendation. Several of the farm papers picked it up. It was discussed at the Bureau on Saturday mornings with a seriousness that the Bureau had not applied to Extension Service matters in years. Calvin read it at the kitchen table on a November morning with Owen sitting across from him. He read it through twice. Then he put it down and drank his coffee. Owen asked what he thought. Calvin said he was doing his job. I was doing mine. His job was to read the numbers. My job was to read the land. He just was not looking at the right thing. Owen said he cost a lot of farmers a lot of topsoil. Calvin said yes, he thought about it. But he wrote the letter. That counts for something. A man who writes that letter at 70 is doing something that most men cannot do at any age. He picked up his coffee cup and looked out the kitchen window at the north fields, where the November light lay flat and gray over the cut stubble, and beyond the fields the timber stood on the ridge. In its November bareness, the leaves down the branches black against the gray sky, the root systems going deep into the limestone that had made the ground impossible to plow in 1891 and had thereby saved the trees that had thereby saved the farm. Calvin Morse farmed until 1988 when he was 73 years old, and Owen was ready to take the full weight of the operation. He did not stop walking the timber. He walked it less frequently, as his 70s wore on 3 times a week instead of every day, then twice a week, then when the weather was good and the mood was on him, which was often enough that the timber knew his footsteps as well as it had ever known them. He died in the winter of 2004, at 89 years old, in the farmhouse where he had lived his entire adult life with Owen and Owen's children around him, and the north fields visible through the bedroom window. White with snow, the timber standing dark on the ridge beyond them. The oaks that Harlan Morse had left standing in 1891 were 113 years old when Calvin died. Some of them had trunks 5 feet across. The canopy they threw in summer was as wide and complete as it had ever been the selective harvests of 1982, and a second smaller harvest Owen had done in 1998, having taken the oldest trees and left the younger ones to fill the gaps. The way good forestry always works. Always has worked, the forest renewing itself on the same ground, where it has always been using the same limestone ridge and the same deep leaf mat and the same species that had arranged themselves by competition and adaptation over a century and more. The timber was worth more in 2004 than the entire farm had been worth when Calvin inherited it in 1942. Owen's daughter June took over the management of the farm and the timber when Owen retired. She was the fourth generation of Morse on that ground, the fourth generation to walk the path through the south gate and follow the ridge north through the heart of the stand. She had grown up in the timber the way Calvin had grown up in it, learning the individual trees, the way you learn the faces of people you see every day by accumulation and repetition, and the slow deepening of familiarity. She knew which tree had been struck by lightning in 1994 and had recovered the wound bark slowly closing over the scar. She knew where the spring morels came up in May at the base of the big bur oaks and the ridgetop in the same places they had come up when Calvin harvested them and Elaine sold them. She knew the particular sound the canopy made in a northwest wind, the way the oak leaves talked to each other at different pitches depending on the wind speed, a sound she had heard from her earliest childhood, and that she understood the way you understand a language you were born into. Every spring, the snow melted on the south side of the timber and soaked into the north fields the way it had soaked into them every spring since before anyone alive could remember. Every summer, the northwest winds hit the canopy and lost their force before they reached the corn, the way they had always lost it, the physics of it unchanged by the passage of generations. Every fall, the leaves came down and blew onto the north edge of the cornfield and decomposed over winter into the organic matter that made the Morse Farm's North Acres the deepest and darkest and most productive soil in that part of Hardin County. The county around the Morse timber had largely recovered from the clearing of the 1960s in the way that landscapes recover from human decisions over the long time frame that landscapes operate in. Some farmers had planted shelter belts in the 1980s and 1990s, rows of trees along their field boundaries that provided a fraction of the protection that mature woodlots had provided better than nothing, far less than what had been lost. The SCS and then the NRCS had run programs to encourage the restoration of hedgerows and riparian buffers. Some of the old fence rows had been allowed to grow back. The landscape was not what it had been in 1957 before the chainsaws and would not be what it had been in any time frame relevant to any person currently living, but it was moving slowly and imperfectly in a direction that the evidence of the drought years and the erosion studies and Lyle Beckett's published letter had suggested it needed to move. The Morse timber did not need to move in any direction. It had stayed where it was. June walked the ridge on a May morning, the spring morels up at the base of the bur oaks, the redbud blooming on the south edge, the canopy just coming into its new season leaf, that pale, translucent green of early May, that is nothing like the deep, heavy green of August, lighter and more tentative, the forest testing the season before committing to it. She stopped at the big white oak on the south ridge, the tree her grandfather had put his hand on 1,000 times, the tree that Harlan Morse had not cut in 1891, because the ground it stood on was too rocky to plow. The tree that had been standing when Calvin was born and had been standing when Calvin died, and was still standing now 5 feet across at the base, its root system going down 30 feet into the limestone, its canopy shading a quarter-acre of ground in full summer. She put her hand on the bark. The bark was warm already in the May sun, the deep ridges of it under her palm, the way they had been under Calvin's palm and under the palms of every Morse who had walked to this tree and stood here and put a hand on the bark and felt whatever it is you feel when you touch something that has been alive longer than your memory goes and will be alive longer than your imagination reaches. She stood there for a while. The timber was not scenery. It had never been scenery, though that was what Walt Gruber had called it in a Farm Bureau room in Kenton in 1963, before the drought and the erosion studies and the timber sale and the letter in the extension newsletter had given the county a different vocabulary for what was standing on the north ridge of the Morse property. It was not wasted ground. It had never been wasted ground, though. Lyle Beckett's 1959 bulletin had implied as much in the careful economic language of a young man who had been taught to see farmland in terms of what it produced and not in terms of what it sustained. It was a farm, 30 acres of it, the most productive 30 acres on the Morse property, not because it produced corn or soybeans or any crop that the elevator would weigh and price, but because it made possible the productivity of everything around it, the way a foundation makes possible, the house above it quietly and invisibly, and without credit doing its work, whether or not anyone is paying attention. Calvin Morse had paid attention for 46 years. His grandfather had left the trees by accident. His father had left them by default. Calvin had left them by choice, by the sustained and deliberate choice of a man who watched carefully and drew honest conclusions from what he saw, and who kept his conclusions through 20 years of being told he was wrong by people with more credentials and more social authority and more economic theory than he possessed. He had not been stubborn. Stubborn is what you call a man when you do not understand his reasons. Calvin Morse had reasons. They were written in the soil color of his north fields and the moisture levels in his spring and the bird populations in his canopy and the yield numbers in a drought year and the green ledger that Elaine had kept behind the dish towels for 35 years. He had been right about what he was looking at. He had just been looking at the right thing. June took her hand off the bark and walked the rest of the ridge and came out through the south gate in the late morning light and went back across the north field to the house where the kitchen window looked out over the field toward the timber the way it had always looked, the way it had looked when Calvin stood at it with his morning coffee in April of 1958 and heard the chainsaws start up in the distance and knew what was coming. The timber stood on the ridge behind her as she walked. It had been standing for 130 years. It would be standing long after the last person who knew this story had told it for the last time. That was the nature of things that are built correctly and left alone to do their work. They outlast the arguments made against them. They outlast the experts who could not see them. They outlast the laughter of the rooms where they were discussed and dismissed. They outlast everything except the ground they stand on and the seasons that move through them year after year, doing what they have always done, asking nothing, requiring nothing, providing everything. The trees stood. They had always stood.